This is Black Sheep Knitting. I'm Nancy, and we are located in the center of Needham, not far from downtown Boston, so we're easy to reach. We are open, just for those of you who don't know, we are open here in the store Tuesday through Saturday from 1 to 5. So please come, but we also have an online shop, and we're putting more and more things on there every day, so you can easily shop. You can stop and pick up whatever you've ordered online, or we can ship it to you, and we ship anywhere in the US. Today I thought I would talk a little bit about tips and tricks that I know, and I thought maybe everybody could use a refresher on some things that I find helpful when I knit. The first thing is, of course, doing a gauge. And when you're doing a gauge, I used to recommend the total number of stitches on the actual gauge. So on a pattern, it would say 20 stitches over 4 inches. I now think I would triple that and make a good sized gauge, because your knitting can differ a little bit when your gauge can differ a little bit as you get knitting into the project. And you want to get a good representation of how that fabric is, how it looks, and if you like it. And, you know, for some things you don't have to have an exact gauge. For a scarf, for instance, or a shawl, doesn't have to be exact. But if you want something to fit, such as a hat or a sweater, you really want your gauge to be pretty accurate. So I think, and I know people think gauge is a pain in the neck, but it's a bigger pain in the neck to pull out a whole hat that you've made too big. I had a student this morning who she hadn't knit that much, but she discovered very quickly that it was way too big. So rather than have to pull things out, which is not a great thing to have to do, you can do a gauge, which takes a lot less time. You can also, people do recommend, and you can read that in patterns, they recommend you wash and block the gauge, which is even more accurate. So you can decide to do that or not. You also, if you're knitting in the round, or knitting as we talked about last time, Fair Isle, you need to do a gauge in the round, which means you need to be knitting every stitch, because that's how you're going to be doing the pattern. So what you do is knit to the end, bring your yarn around the back loosely, and then start knitting again where you started. So you'll end up with a gauge, you know, good size gauge, and it'll have lots of yarn around the back, because each time after you knit a row, you're going to take your yarn, bring it around again to where you started, and knit again as if you were knitting in the round. And that gives you a very accurate read. The thing about Fair Isle knitting, and I may have mentioned it in the last video, it can tend to be tight, or pucker if you're pulling your floats, the contrasting color, if you're pulling that too tight against the back. So some patterns recommend that you go up 1 needle size so that doesn't happen. I had, and you can see my sweater that I had shown before this, Sewaldo, I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, I'm sure, but I had a little puckering on this, but I was able to block it. I wet blocked this. So anyway, gauge. Here's a little tip on when you're casting on, say you have to cast on 300 stitches for something. Well, that is so boring to count, and you lose, if you're like me, you lose count. So what I do is I either count 20 stitches, put in a stitch marker every 20, or every 50. But it's much easier to count 20 stitches. One thing that people have trouble with is casting on and binding off. And your cast on and your bind off should have the same elasticity and feel exactly like the fabric that you're knitting. If it's too tight, it's going to look funny for one, but suppose it's too tight around your neck, you can't get it on your head, or a sock that you can't get over your foot. So you want to make sure that you're casting off, then they're cast-offs or bind-offs that are stretchy. You can Google that, stretchy bind-off, and you'll find some good tutorials on how to do that. I've figured out on my own how far I need to pull after I knit the stitches and I get the two on the needle as if to bind off. When I bind off and pull the yarn through, I know just how far to pull that stitch out to give me a stretchy bind off. But that comes with a tremendous amount of practice. So I wouldn't trust that kind of thing. I would Google and make sure you do that. And also make sure after you've cast on and you start knitting that your cast on isn't too tight, because it's the same thing. If you're casting on a sweater from the top down, from the neck down, or even from the bottom up, you don't want that to be too tight. So it pays to stop and check. And I would say that about all of your knitting. I always, after I've knit, maybe this much, I stop and look at all my knitting to look and see what it looks like. And that is so important, because you can knit and knit and knit and oh my God, I made a huge mistake and it's way down. And then how do I fix it? So that's a problem. If you're knitting with a hand dyed, and we have Rios is one of our more popular yarns, and if you're knitting with a hand dyed yarn, you would be, particularly if you're making, on a scarf I wouldn't care, but if you're making a sweater, you would be wise to do every other row alternating 2 skeins, so that number one, you don't get pooling, and number two, you don't get a dramatic difference. Hand dyes can be quite different, and if you have, suppose you have these two, and you may not be able to see it on camera, but these are slightly different because they're hand dyed. So if you want something, I don't particularly care. Here's another one that's much more pinky, orangey than pink. I don't particularly care because that doesn't bother me in my knitting, but some people want something that's more uniform and doesn't have pooling or odd, a big difference between here and then the next color. So if you don't want to have that, you would knit over and back with one color, pick up the other color over and back, and you would continue to do that throughout the whole sweater. And you'll be much happier with the result. I thought of this because a student once did a scarf and didn't really look at what she was knitting, and she came in and was horrified when she laid it out that there was a big difference between 2 colorways. Now, on a scarf, I wouldn't care because I'm putting them around my neck, and what's the difference? If it changes color, that'd be fun for me. But that's what I'm like. Not everybody's like that. People ask if you're supposed to slip a stitch, how do you do it? Purlwise or knitwise? If it says knitwise, meaning you stick your needle into the stitch as if to knit and slip it over to the right hand needle. If it doesn't say, and if it says slip a stitch, then that means purlwise. Your needle goes in as if to purl and puts it on the right hand needle. Now you might ask why. Well, what it does is it keeps the stitch mounted the way it should be. So it's just moving it over to the other needle, and it's in the exact same position that it was on your, otherwise if you would have to untwist it. So if they want you to do it knitwise, they want it sort of twisted. So we had somebody came in the other day with a sweater or a scarf, and it was going like this, and she wanted to know what had happened. Well, what can happen is when you go to knit the beginning of a row, there's a loopy piece of yarn that some people think is a stitch, and they knit into that loop. But you really have to look at your needle and say, what's the loop that's on my needle? That's what you knit into. So beginners often make that mistake to knit into what is the loop from the stitch below. And that little loose area gets taken up when you knit that first stitch. So always make sure you're only knitting what's on the actual needle. A couple last tips. There's a little bit of difference between dropped stitches. Sometimes a drop stitch will appear like just a loop hanging out, and you can see that you dropped the stitch. Sometimes a stitch doesn't get knit, and we think that's a dropped stitch, but it's really just a stitch that was missed when you were knitting, and you'll see a bar behind the stitch, and you can tell if you have that straight bar from the stitch on either side of your stitch that's missing the yarn, you can see that it didn't get knit, and you can simply put your needle into that stitch and lift the bar over it, depending whether it's a knit or a purl, and you can experiment with that to see how it works. Let's see, and you'll see kind of what can be called a ladder. You know, if you miss some stitches, you'll see that in the back. But if you have a dropped stitch, the one that actually hangs out, the best thing to do is to right away put a locking stitch marker into it, and depending on how far down it is, you can either lock it onto the needle or lock it onto the bars that you see above it. And then you can go back and fix that. And at some point, maybe I'll show another video on how to pick that up. And lastly, another tip is be sure to read all the written information on your pattern. It's critical. Sometimes you really can miss a lot. And I was knitting a very, very complicated sweater recently, and I went back several times to read the information, and she had a lot of really good information in the beginning of the pattern. And I'm not saying to read the whole pattern. I don't always think that's such a good idea, although I heard somebody recently who said she reads knitting patterns at night before she goes to bed, that she really enjoys that. I don't recommend it. I think you should just make sure you read all the glossary, which has all the definitions of the abbreviations in your pattern. I would read anything that's written in the beginning of your pattern. I would make sure you read. And as you go through the pattern, there may be things inserted in there. Be sure to read those. It's so important because it's so easy to miss things. So take care, wear your mask, and stay healthy. Bye.